أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم. الحمد لله رب العالمين، والصلاة والسلام على سيدنا ونبينا وحبيب قلوبنا وشفيع ذنوبنا وطبيب نفوسنا أبي القاسم محمد. اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين، واللعنة الدائم على أعدائهم أجمعين. أما بعد، فقد قال الله الحكيم في محكم كتابه الكريم: أعوذ بالله من الشيطان الرجيم. يا أيها الذين آمنوا كونوا قوامين بالقسط شهداء لله ولو على أنفسكم أو الوالدين والأقربين. صدق الله العلي العظيم. صلوات اللهم صل على محمد وعلى محمد وعجل فرجه. For the love of our beloved Prophet and his beloved progeny, please recite a second loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajah. For the hastening and the return of our beloved 12th Imam, a third final loud salawat. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad wa ala Muhammad wa ajil farajah. Last night we started to discuss this topic of the relatives and how the Ahlul-Bayt have taught us to treat them and how the Ahlul-Bayt have taught us to interact with them. We said that the Quran uses different terminology and different vocabulary to refer to the general idea of those who are connected to you, those who are related to you. Sometimes the Quran will use the word al or ahl. Sometimes the Quran will use the word ar-arham, and many times, more often than not, it will use the word dhawil qurba. We said that this terminology and these words, they have their own specific meanings. Each of them has their own specific connotation. And in many situations, they can have very important implications depending on which word it is that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala is using. Nonetheless, as a general concept, they all refer to those individuals in your life that you are related to, those relatives of yours. And we said that when you look at the verses of the Quran, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala has put this idea of maintaining family ties very high up on his priority list. If he were to give you and I a list of those things that are extremely important to him, you will find the idea of the arham is very high on that list. That's why verses of Surah An-Nisa, verses of Surah Al-Baqarah, they spoke about maintaining the family ties immediately after making sure that the believer does not do shirk. After the concept of shirk came the idea of وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا, and immediately afterwards وَبِذِلْ قُرْبًا. After shirk and after tawheed, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala mentions this idea of dhawil qurba. In that covenant that the Quran narrates for us in Surah Al-Baqarah, that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala took from Bani Israel, this is also the second concept that comes up. وَبِالْوَالِدَيْنِ إِحْسَانًا. Your parents of course are first in line, then after that comes وَبِذِلْ قُرْبًا, and those who you are relatives with. And the verses of the Quran tell us that this idea of maintaining ties is extremely important. Further than that, when you look into hadith, you find that hadith also emphasizes this idea and tells you of the reward and the effects that Silatul Rahim can have on your day-to-day life. The hadith of the sixth Imam, or the fifth Imam rather, explained to us the 5 different effects that Silatul Rahim can have on the life of the human being. And in particular, the last one of them that Imam al-Baqir mentioned, he said, وَتُنْسِي فِي الْأَجَلِ, and it prolongs the life of the human being. We mentioned this one is one that hadith emphasizes on even more. That's why we have multiple ahadith from the sixth Imam in which he explains to his companions that sometimes the life of a human being is prolonged simply because they did Salatul Rahim, simply because they visited a relative, simply because they checked up on a relative. And we went through that hadith in which he turned to his companion by the name of Muyassir. He said, Ya Muyassir, قَدْ حَذَرَ أَجَلُكَ غَيْرُ مَرَّةٍ. Your life was supposed to end multiple times by now. But simply because you did this Salatul Rahim, you're in front of us and you're breathing and you are still alive. At the same time, on the other hand, you find hadith is very harsh, and the verses of the Quran are very harsh on the one who completely cuts off these ties, the one who is al-qati'u lirrahim. And we went through the hadith in which the fourth Imam was advising his son, the fifth Imam. He said, Ya bunayya undur khamsatan, stay away from 5 people. And the fifth of those 5 individuals was the one who had cut off his family ties. And the fourth Imam mentioned that this person has been cursed in the verses of the Quran, fi thalathati mawadi'. In 3 different verses, this person has been cursed. And we also talked about the idea of inheritance and how Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala somehow, some way wants to maintain these family ties. A portion of your wealth, somehow, some way, it seems as though He wants it to end up in the hands of these relatives. Even if you decide for your wealth to go somewhere else, in Islam, you don't have that full authority. The money that you leave behind, the wealth that you leave behind, a portion of it, you have authority over it. Another portion of it, the most of it, in fact, you may not have that authority over it. So Islam is trying to maintain these family ties one way or another. And the reason, the societal effect that these family ties have is a separate discussion. But what we can see in the society that we live in today, and really around the world today, is the human being becoming more and more isolated. People on their deathbeds, and there is no one to come and sit by the deathbed of this person. And you can imagine if someone is lonely at their deathbed, you can imagine how lonely they were during the rest of the days of their life. Because when you're on your deathbed, at least relatives, people, friends, family, now they want to gather. If there's no one even at that time, you can imagine how isolated and lonely this individual was. And Islam does not want us to get to this point. This is why our Prophet emphasized maintaining these family ties so much. At the same time, and this is where we said our discussion takes a little bit of a turn, as much as Islam has emphasized maintaining these ties, Islam also does not want you to just surrender yourself to relatives. Islam has given you the authority, has allowed you, and sometimes requires you to manage your relationships with your relatives, to balance these relationships with your relatives, to draw boundaries between yourself and your relatives. And Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does this in verse 53 of Surah An-Nur very beautifully with the relatives of the Prophet. Just because Muhammad is your relative does not mean you can come and go as you wish. Just because he's your relative doesn't mean after the majlis is done you can sit for hours and hours. He's our relative, we can stay here. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala teaches us that we are to maintain these ties but manage them and balance them at the same time. And we also mentioned that some of the individuals who were the closest to the Prophet, the closest relatives to the Prophet, instead of being a means of support for him, ended up being a means of a test for him. Amongst him, his uncle Abu Lahab. And amongst his uncles, again, Abbas, in his own particular way, not to the extent of the Abu Lahabs of the world, but in his own way, the Prophet had to be patient with Abbas as well. Not everyone was like Hamza. Not everyone was there to support the Prophet 100%. This is where we ended our discussion yesterday, and we will continue with this topic tonight by posing the following questions. Number 1, when we look at the relationships that the Prophet had with his relatives, did the Prophet spend the same amount of time with all of his relatives? Or did he value certain relationships more while valuing other relationships a bit less while maintaining his ties with everybody? Number 2, how did the Prophet show his forgiveness to those relatives of his that for 20 years were creating problems for him when he returned back to the city of Mecca. Number 3, should I always be in a position where I support my relatives 100% in any endeavor that they take and in any stance that they take? Or are there also situations where I may not be allowed to support my relative just because this person is my relative? Number 4, when the Quran speaks about the individual on the Day of Judgment who is given his book of deeds in his left hand, or as other verses of the Quran say, he is given his book of his deeds behind his back. What factor does the Quran mention about this person that shows us why he ended up in this position? And number 5, and finally, what is a deeper understanding and a more batini understanding, a more esoteric understanding of this concept of rahim? And how does that help someone who finds himself in a situation where his relatives, his friends, might have turned away from him? They might have abandoned him. His rahim is not there for him. Maybe there is another rahim for him that he may not necessarily know about. Tonight, inshallah, we'll delve into these 5 questions with a loud salawat ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad. Allow us to begin from here. When you look at the life of the Prophet, you don't find that his relationships were all the same. No, you find the exact contrary to that. You find the exact opposite of that. There were certain relationships of the Prophet, there were certain relatives of the Prophet that the Prophet would spend a lot of time with. There were other relatives that he had maintained ties with them, but he did not value the relationship the same. Not every relationship is the same. Just because Islam says that you have to maintain family ties doesn't mean every single relative is the same. No, some of them are a greater influence on you. Some of them are a terrible influence on you. Some of them have the wonderful akhlaq. Some of them have the worst akhlaq. We all have all sorts of relatives at the end of the day. Islam is not here to say you have to spend the same amount of time with all of them. And you see this in the life of the Prophet very beautifully, because amongst the relatives of the Prophet was none but Ali ibn Abi Talib. And you look at the relationship that the Prophet had with Ali ibn Abi Talib, and then you look at the relationship he had with his other relatives, not even close. He maintained his ties with everybody, yes? But certain relationships he valued more. Certain individuals he spent a lot more time with them because that relationship was much more important. And Ali ibn Abi Talib in his khutbahs, this is one of the main complaints that he has after the issue of Khilafah came up. Over and over again in his khutbahs, he turns to the Sahaba of the Prophet. He says, you know who I am. You know the type of relationship I used to have with the Prophet and the Prophet used to have with me. He did not have that relationship with any of you or any of his relatives. The relationship he had with me was a different relationship. And you all know this. But now in this situation, you're denying it. And he beautifully explains the relationship that he had with the Prophet. He says, you know what? I used to visit the Prophet. I used to spend time with the Prophet once during the day and once during the night. That's a lot. That's a lot. Imagine you visit a friend once during the day, once during the nighttime. That's a lot of time you're spending together. And then he starts to explain. He says, you know what? When the Prophet, when I used to spend time with him, sometimes I would go to his house. Sometimes he would come to my house. This is the relationship I had with the Prophet. Did the Prophet used to come to your houses? No, you used to go to his houses. Prophet used to come to my house. And very beautifully he says, when I used to go to his house and the wives were there, he would ask them sometimes to give us some privacy. This is a special relationship we have. But he beautifully says, when the Prophet used to come to visit me, he would never ask for Fatima and Hassan and Hussein to get up and leave. This family is special. Just a point on the side. And then he continues, he says, every time we used to sit, I used to just ask questions of the Prophet used to answer, and when my questions were done, I didn't have any more questions, he would start the conversation with me. Did the Prophet spend the same amount of time with all of his relatives? No, not even close. Some relatives you want to spend all of this time with. Some relatives you might just maintain a minimal level. Yes, that minimal level Absolutely wajib. So Islam allows us to manage and balance these relationships. But one thing that Islam wants from us in our marital relationships, in our friendships, and especially in the relationships that we have with our relatives is the following, and that is the concept of forgiveness. It's not easy. It's not easy. But Islam wants this from us. Because at the end of the day, when you have relatives and you spend time with them, they will say something. God forbid you say something, you make a comment, they say something. At the end of the day, there are times where there's some friction. At the end of the day, there's situations you walk away and you're a bit upset, or they're a bit upset, so on and so forth. Forgiveness is a big key to these relationships. It's not going to work if people don't approach it with a sense of forgiveness. And who was the pinnacle of this? Who was the best example of this? None but the Prophet himself. Because as we mentioned yesterday, the Prophet didn't have the best relatives. No, not even close. He had relatives that created problems for him. But when that time came where he was in a position of authority, he was in a position of control and power, and their lives were in the hands of the Prophet, that's when he showed them his forgiveness. When did this happen? When the Prophet finally had the opportunity to come back to Mecca. We read about this in history. We don't even understand the significance of it. This is where things completely changed for Islam as a whole and for the Arabian Peninsula as well. Because before that, the Prophet was simply in Medina. Yes, there were other tribes, so on and so forth, that were now starting to believe in him. But Mecca was the stronghold. The moment he took over Mecca, that changed everything forever. So the Prophet is now putting together this army to come and enter into Mecca and conquer Mecca again. And I'm even hesitant to use the word conquer, because the way he did it was almost nothing like conquering a city. Because when you conquer a city, you walk in there, na'udhu billah, you kill people, you do as you wish because you're in a position of authority. Go read history, go see how kings used to do this stuff. And yet the Prophet took over Mecca with almost no bloodshed. Yes, there were certain individuals outside of that, and there were reasons for that, of course. Outside of that, find the mercy of the Prophet. And you read the narrations, this army of Islam came together. And the army was so great that the Prophet, the day before they entered into Mecca, this is happening in the month of Ramadan. Before they entered into Mecca, the Prophet ordered the Muslimin who had all gathered outside of Mecca to start up fires. You know these fires you start up if you're staying somewhere? He ordered all of them to start up fires. And Quraysh, some of the heads of Quraysh saw this. And initially, there were so many fires, they said, no, these aren't the Muslimin. They don't have this type of numbers. This is some other tribe that's trying to attack us. When they came closer, they realized, no, this is the Muslimin. And Abu Sufyan, he surrendered himself before the Prophet even entered into Mecca. So all of this happens, the day comes now, where the Prophet is now going to manifest his power and his authority over these relatives who have been bothering him and torturing his companions for 20 years. 13 years roughly, the Prophet is in Mecca. The Fath of Mecca takes place 8th year after Hijrah. If you do the math, you're looking at 21 years. Persecution, torturing, creating battles, Badr, Uhud, Khandaq, so on and so forth. The day came, and Abu Sufyan has already surrendered, and you already start to see the mercy and the forgiveness of the Prophet. He said, if you stay in your home, you don't have anything to worry about. If you come and you stand around the Kaaba, you don't have anything to worry about. I will give one of my companions a flag. If you stand under his flag, you have nothing to worry about. So many avenues for you to not worry about anything. If someone didn't know, he would think that this is just some random city he's taking over, not the city that's been creating problems for him for 21 years. Then what happened? This army starts to march into Mecca. Look at this moment that shows you the akhlaq of our Prophet. This army is marching into the city of Mecca. And the person who is holding the flag of the Prophet in this particular situation, according to one narration, Sa'd ibn Ubadah from Medina. And he is walking into Mecca and he passes by Abu Sufyan. And he turns to Abu Sufyan and he says, you know what, Abu Sufyan? Al-yawm yawmul malhama. Today is the day we strike back. Today is the day of the epic battle. Today is the day that we take revenge. Malhama. And this lines of troops continued. And the Prophet now was passing by Abu Sufyan. He was stationary and the army was passing by. And then Abu Sufyan turned to the Prophet. He said, Muhammad, I've heard you said, Al-yawm yawmul malhama, you're going to kill your relatives today. Is that what you're going to do? And the Prophet turned towards him. He said, no, Sa'd ibn Ubadah is wrong. Al-yawm, today is not yawmul malhama. Today is yawmul marhama. Today is the day I forgive. And all of these relatives who had wronged him for so long, they gathered around the Kaaba. And the narration says that the Prophet turned towards them, and he said, what do you think I should do with you? What do you expect of me? They said, Ya Rasulullah, 100% you are right. We have nothing to come back to you with. But you are our relative. We expect forgiveness from you. We expect kindness from you, compassion from you. And then look at the lines that the Prophet uttered, so beautiful. In those moments, these are relatives who have been bothering him for 20 years. It's almost as if he forgives them in 20 seconds. He turned to these relatives of his. He said, I will say to you the same thing that my brother Yusuf said to his brothers. He said, لا تثريب عليكم اليوم. There is no blame upon you today. يغفر الله لكم وهو أرحم الراحمين. Allah will forgive you. And it's very interesting. Nowhere did the Prophet say, I forgive you. As if he's already removed himself from this whole equation. He says, yes, I'm already forgiven you. Allah will also forgive you. يغفر الله لكم وهو أرحم الراحمين. He's the most merciful of all. At the end of the day, you and I will have relatives. They will do some things that are wrong. We will do some things that are wrong. At the end of the day, if there is no spirit of forgiveness, everything is going to fall apart. In any relationship, especially with relatives, there has to be a sense of forgiveness. Recite a salawat, please. Allahumma salli ala Muhammad. This is all on one hand. Last night, tonight, we've been talking about what you owe to your relatives. Then comes the other side, which is the other extreme. The other extreme is what? This person now values his relatives too much. Say, value relatives too much. Is this even possible? Yes, believe it or not, it's possible. How can you value a relative too much? This person thinks that because this person is a relative, because of this cousin, because of this aunt, because of this uncle, whatever they do, he has to get behind them. Whatever stance they take, I have to support them. And this was a problem during the time of the Prophet. Dare I say it's a problem in our communities today as well. Where many times you will find in our communities across North America, where there is a dispute in the community, it's almost as if your last name is this, you're on this side. If your last name is that, you're automatically on the other side. It's almost as if no one is even looking at this situation and saying, well, where does the truth lie? No, I have to support. I have to. Why? This is my uncle. I have to. This is my aunt. This is my 34th cousin. I have to support them. We're related. This is a problem. And this was a problem during the time of the Prophet as well. And it was one of the main challenges that the Muslims had. Because we mentioned yesterday that when this categorization of Iman and Kufr happened, the people on both sides were relatives of one another. It was difficult for the Muslims to give up some of their identity as part of this family and part of that family and understand they have a new identity now. It's difficult for them. And they had relatives who had animosity towards Islam, but they couldn't say no to their relatives. In some occasions, they would share secrets with them. In some occasions, they would say, you know what, we're friends with you and we're Muslim, both. Even though you have animosity towards the Muslims, which doesn't apply to most of our relatives. Yes, this is very rare for us to come across. But in that particular context, there were people on the other side who were thirsty for the blood of Muslims. And this person, because this person was a relative, he couldn't say no to him. He's my relative. And in our communities, it's also the same thing. In a different context, when this relative takes a stance, it's almost as if this person says, I have no choice, I have to support this person. No, Islam never told you and I to give this much value to a relative, where they override the truth and everything with it. The Quran said from the very beginning, Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu, la tattakhidhu aba'akum wa ikhwanakum awliya in istahabbu al-kufra ala al-iman. If they are the type that have animosity towards the Muslims, you can't just sit there and say, I support whatever stance you take. No. And in our communities, when I see a relative of mine who's taken the wrong stance, who is violating the rights of others, who is taking from the wealth of others, who is playing with the reputation of others, and you can add, many of the other examples that comes to our mind, you and I also can't get behind this person. He's your relative. Yes, this is your test. You have to find a way to say, listen, I don't agree with this approach. And one of the reasons why our communities have been held back sometimes is this. I don't want to go into details here. But this is one of the reasons why our communities have been held back. Because this kind of stuff starts to show itself. And this concept in Quran and Hadith is referred to as al-asabiyya. Now, you want to use the exact terminology, you would say tribalism. But I don't like that particular, equivalent, because it makes it seem as though it doesn't apply to us today. No, tribalism is the definition of asabiyya, but if you really want to talk about it, it means, you'll have a relative of yours do something, you'll be okay with it just because he's your relative. If this person was not your relative, you would be criticizing him. Or I might be in this situation, for example. This is what asabiyya is. And the hadith of the 6th Imam says, this asabiyya, this hamiyya, or the Quran calls it hamiyyat al-jahiliyya. This fervorness that you have because he's related to me, we're going to do this. The Quran says, and the hadith of the 6th Imam says, that this asabiyya is one of the junudul jahl. It's one of the troops of ignorance. It's one of the manifestations of ignorance. Why? Because during the time of the Prophet, if a relative did something, no one could say no. If one relative was hurt, he would call his tribe. He would call in my words, his gang. And every relative had to come to support him no matter what the reason of this dispute was. And they valued these relationships to the point where they were willing to go to the extent of killing one another because of their relatives. And the Quran talks about this in Surah At-Takathur. He says, Alhaakum At-Takathur. You guys are busy with some random things. This person is my relative, that person is my relative. Aus was saying this, Khazraj was saying this. Hatta zurtumul maqabir. It's gotten so petty. You guys even go to the maqabir and the qabr and you say, you know what, this one was my grandfather, this one was my great-grandfather, and so on and so forth. Well, all of this to do what? To support your wrong stance. This was a problem from the very beginning. And it's also a problem today. And this is why I chose this verse of the Quran at the beginning of the lecture. Ya ayyuhal ladhina amanu kunu qawwamina bil qisti shuhada'a lillah. When you come and you want to bear witness, this might be in the particular context of a court. You may not have to deal with a court necessarily, a dispute, whatever the situation might be. It says, Kunu qawwamina bil qist. When you come and you bear witness, don't allow the idea that this person is your father, your mother, your relative, your cousin, your uncle, your aunt, to sway the truth the way you saw it. Kunu qawwamina bil qist shuhada'a lillah. You're bearing witness because of God. And then he says this, walaw ala anfusikum. Even if you're bearing witness against yourself, awil walidain, even against your parents, wal aqrabin, or your relatives. You have to be able to stick to the truth in these moments. And this is difficult. And it's very interesting that the Quran tells us the one who shows up on the day of judgment, and you know that the verses of the Quran categorizes the human beings on that day into two categories. Those who are given their book of deeds on their right hand, those who are given their book of deeds to their left hand or behind their back. Yes? The Quran says, this person who shows up, وَأَمَّا مَنْ أُوتِيَ كِتَابَهُ وَرَاءَ ظَهْرِهِ, the one who is given his book behind his back, through his left hand. Why did he end up in this position? This is what the Quran says. When they give him that book, فَسَوْفَ يَدْعُ ثُبُورًا, he wishes that he was dead. Thubura, he wishes that he did not exist, because he knows what he has to deal with. وَيَصْلَى سَعِيرًا, and he's going to make his way towards hellfire. But here's the problem. إِنَّهُ كَانَ فِي أَهْلِهِ مَسْرُورًا. When he was with his people and his family and his relatives, everyone was happy. Everyone supported his wrongdoings. Uncle, aunt, yeah, no problem. You're good. You're fine. Sometimes you've seen this. You're having a conversation with somebody. You criticize a particular characteristic about someone else, and it may not even necessarily be backbiting. It might be something that this person does publicly. You just don't agree with it. Then the person you're talking to turns to you and says, wait a second, but imagine if this person is your relative. It turns to you and says, wait a second, but I do this too sometimes. What do you say? You say, no, you're fine, you're good. That one, him, he has problems. Why? Because he's not our relative. But if this person was doing the same thing, you'd criticize him. Because it's a relative, all of a sudden everything is fine. No. And here's the problem when it comes to us doing wrong things because of expectations that relatives have of us. Here's the problem. At the end of the day, when I show up on the day of judgment and someone who has to answer for these deeds that I committed, these same relatives that I did these deeds for are nowhere to be found. They are worrying about their own issues. They're worrying about their own deeds. Wait a minute, I did all of this because of you. You said, come and do this haram, don't worry about it. You said, do this, I'm a relative of yours. I did it because of you. Now when I need your help, you're nowhere to be found. No, they're nowhere to be found. Friends that I do haram for, they're nowhere to be found. And the Quran puts this into perspective in Surah Al-Ma'arij. It says, يَوْمَ تَكُونُ السَّمَاءُ كَالْمُهْلِ. When that moment comes where the heavens, they turn into boiling metal. So the terminology we don't necessarily understand, right? The Quran is just trying to give us a general idea of it, yes? وَتَكُونُ الْجِبَالُ كَالْعِهْنِ. And the mountains are like beaten cotton. Mountain is strong, it's firm. The Quran says we will take it, it will turn into beaten cotton. If you remember back home, they used to make pillows, for example, with cotton, and this cotton was beaten. They had specific tools to beat this cotton to make it soft and fluffy and more comfortable for you. The Quran says we'll take the mountains, they'll turn into what? Beaten cotton. وَتَكُونُ الْجِبَالُ كَالْعِهْنِ. Okay, so all of this for what? What are you trying to get across? What's the main point? He says this is the main point. وَلَا يَسْأَلُ حَمِيمٌ حَمِيمًا. No close friend, no close relative is worried about another close friend or another close relative. No one cares. I thought I did all of this for you. He says, yeah, you did it for me. I don't have time for you right now. I have my own things to worry about. And you're stuck there, I'm stuck there with these things that I did because of this person. وَلَا يَسْأَلُ حَمِيمٌ حَمِيمًا. And then you know what the interesting thing is the Quran says about this relationship that was based on sin. The relationships that are based on truth and based on faith, no, those relationships exist on that day. And you recognize people, and if this is a good person, you will have a good relationship with them. No, the relationships that were based on sin is what we're referring to. He says they don't even care about one another. But it's not that they don't see one another. They see one another on that day. But still they don't even care enough to ask about one another. You know, sometimes you don't see a friend for a long time. You might joke with them. Say, well, it's been a minute since I seen you. It's been a long time since I seen you. And sometimes they'll come back to you with what? Yeah, I was traveling. I was out of town, for example. You know, we didn't run into each other. You know, that's why. The Quran says, no, يُبَصَّرُونَهُمْ. We will make sure to show them to one another. Their eyes will meet on that day. But you know what the problem is? يَوَدُّ الْمُجْرِمُ لَوْ يَفْتَدِي مِنْ عَذَابِ يَوْمَئِذٍ بِبَنِيهِ. This guy sees what he has done, and he sees the punishment. He's willing to give away everything, including his children. He's willing to give everything because he just doesn't want to deal with this punishment. وَصَاحِبَتِهِ وَأَخِيهِ. He's willing to give up his brother, just not have to deal with this punishment. وَفَصِيلَتِهِ الَّتِي تُؤْوِيهِ. And that tribe of his that used to support him. He's willing to give all of it. He doesn't have time for anybody. In other verses of the Quran, Surah Abbas says, فَإِذَا جَاءَتِ الصَّاخَّةِ. When that final moment comes, and that loud sound comes, yes, that critical moment comes, يَوْمَ يَفِرُّ الْمَرْءُ مِنْ أَخِيهِ. This person is running away from his relatives. And it goes on and it moves on. Why? It says, لِكُلِّ امْرِئٍ مِّنْهُمْ يَوْمَئِذٍ شَأْنٌ يُغْنِيهِ. They each have their own things to worry about. I thought you were going to be there for me. No, it turns out this relative, this friend of mine who asked me, you should do this, you should do that, when time comes, you need their help, they're not there for you. You and I have to answer for the stuff that we did ourselves. So as much as Islam teaches us that we are to value our relatives, when it comes to haram, I have to hold back. And this is a fine line. It's not an easy thing to do. It's a difficult thing to do. But you find the prophets of Allah did it very beautifully. Because those who rejected them and those who were their enemies, many times they were their relatives. We talked about the prophet. You see this with the other prophets as well. When Musa alayhi salam went on this trip and he met Shu'aib and then he came back, you know what the first thing was that the Fir'aun of that time told him? The first thing. When he came, he said, I'm a messenger of God, so on and so forth. The first thing that the Fir'aun said, regardless of whether this Fir'aun was the same one who played the role of his father or was the son of that Fir'aun, there is dispute in history. Was it the same one or was it the son of that one? In other words, was this person the person who had played the role of a father for him or someone who had played the role of a brother for him? Either way, it's almost like his relative. What's the first thing that they told Musa when he came back? They said, Musa, wait a second. Alam nurabbika fina walida. Didn't we raise you as one of our own? We're relatives. What is this? وَلَبِثْتَ فِينَا مِنْ عُمْرَكَ سِنِينَ. You lived many years of your life with us. Now you're going against your own people? Musa was tested with this. And amongst those who was also tested with this was Ibrahim, with his uncle Azar. But you find how beautifully Ibrahim managed this relationship. At the same time that he kept telling his uncle, Uncle, I care for you. I'm worried about you. At the same time, he said, I don't agree with your lifestyle. I don't agree with your approach. I cannot agree with this shirk. Narration says that Azar was a person who used to build idols. He used to sell idols. Ibrahim is growing up in a household like this. And yet Ibrahim, he does it very beautifully. When you look at the verses of the Quran, he is very affectionate towards his uncle. Uncle, I want to guide you. Ya abati la ta'bud ash-shaytan. Ya abati inni akhafu. I'm worried about you. But at the same time, he says what? وَأَعْتَزِلُكُمْ وَمَا تَدْعُونَ مِن دُونِ اللَّهِ. When it comes to my values, I'm not going to compromise on my values. وَأَعْتَزِلُكُمْ. I will separate my path from you. So this is important to remember. But someone says, and with this inshallah I'll bring tonight's talk to an end. Someone says, Shaykh, you know what? I'm in a position. I want to maintain my family ties. I want to spend time with my relatives. But for whatever reason, they have completely turned away from me. They have completely abandoned me. Maybe it's because this person wants to practice the religion, for example. Maybe it's because of the opposite of that. Believe it or not, you'll find times where you have relatives that are so judgmental because this person is not a fully practicing individual. Other people assume that they're supposed to cut off ties completely. You'll have these types of misunderstandings as well, regardless of which category you and I fall in. My relatives have turned away from me. They've abandoned me. I call them, I message them. There's no message in return. There's no call in return. As much as I try to be a part of these gatherings, as much as I try to be nice and kind to them, it seems like they don't want this. This is where the deeper concept of ar-rahim comes into the picture. Because the reality is, this concept of rahim has a zahiri meaning, it has an apparent meaning, and then it has a deeper, more hidden, more esoteric meaning to it as well. And that is this: on the basic level, your rahim are those that you are related to through blood, through the womb. This is your rahim on a basic level. And this is a correct understanding of rahim. We're not saying it's a wrong understanding. No, it's a correct understanding of ar-rahim. And when the marja says you have to maintain family ties with your arham, he's referring to this meaning of the word rahim and arham. So this is correct. At the same time, there is a deeper layer. Those that you are truly connected to. So how am I truly connected to them? Because you are actually like them. You actually share characteristics with them. Therefore, you are related to them. So what does this mean? At the end of the day, what is it that makes you who you are? What is your identity? Yes, you might say, my name is this is where I grew up, this is what makes me who I am. Yes, in the worldly sense of it, that is what makes you who you are, and so on and so forth. That's not our discussion. But at the very deep layer and level of it, Islam says what makes you who you are is your iman. Islam categorizes human beings into what? So this person turned away from the truth. This person accepted the truth. This one had iman. Therefore, those who actually have iman like you are your true rahim. And those who've turned away from the truth, you are not related to at a deeper layer, deeper level. Though you might have the last name with them. And those that you share this iman and this faith with are who? They are the believers at large, and at the very top of them is the Ahlul-Bayt and the Prophet himself. And this gives us a little bit of perspective into these lines of the Prophet, whose the narration says that he said, "Ana wa Aliyun abawa hadhihi al-ummah." We're the fathers of this ummah. We look at this, we say, yes, as a metaphor, he means that he cares for the ummah, he takes care of the ummah. Yes, but it could have a deeper meaning of what? No, you are actually connected to them. Because they are your true rahim. At a deeper level. And this is why Ali ibn Abi Talib has a beautiful line. He says, رُبَّ أَخٍ لَمْ تَلِدْهُ أُمُّكِ. How many brothers and sisters you have that your mother never gave birth to? They're not biological brothers and sisters. They're closer than biological brothers and sisters. And this is why the companion of the sixth Imam, when he came to the sixth Imam and he recited verses of the Quran, الَّذِينَ يَصِلُونَ مَا أَمَرَ اللَّهُ بِهِ أَن يُوصَلْ, wording that is used in multiple verses of the Quran. Those who maintain the ties that they are supposed to maintain. And he asked Imam Sadiq, said, what is these ties that the verse of the Quran is talking about? The hadith says, this is Rahimu Alu Muhammad. This is the rahim, that connection, that tie you have with who? With those that you are truly a relative of. And of course, the companion was thinking the same thing you and I are thinking. But what about my normal rahim? What about those I'm connected through blood and through the womb? And Imam al-Sadiq said, he said, لا تكونن ممن. Don't be one of those people who assumes the verse of the Quran only has one meaning. That's correct. At a deeper layer, deeper level, this is also what it means. Who was the prime example of this? The prime example of a person whose relatives abandoned him, didn't even care about him, and yet he found for himself another rahim in the Ahlul-Bayt and the Prophet was none but Salman. Salman left his rahim a long time ago. He had no relatives. He didn't even spend time with the Prophet. In the 13 years the Prophet was in Mecca, he didn't even see the Prophet there either. He joined the Prophet where? In Medina when he was a slave. And yet the Ahlul Bayt said, no, Salman has a rahim. We are his rahim. Salmanu minna Ahlul Bayt. Salman is part of us. This is why the companion of the sixth Imam came to him, asked him a question, and the answer and the response of Imam Sadiq was so beautiful. He said, Ya Aba Abdullah, the kunya of the sixth Imam. He said, Ya Aba Abdullah, many times I hear you speak of the greatness of Salman al-Farisi. If you could tell me, why do you say so many great things about Salman al-Farisi? What makes Salman al-Farisi so special? And Imam Sadiq looked at him and he said, before I even answer your question, La taqul Salman al-Farisi. Let's correct this first. Don't say Salman the Persian. Say Salman al-Muhammadi. Say Salman, the one who's related to Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. That is his true rahim. And if I find myself in a situation where relatives have turned away from me, friends have turned away from me, people have isolated me, they have abandoned me, no one responds to my salam, no one responds to this message, that message, I have to understand at the end of the day, I have another rahim of my own as well. With that, inshallah, we'll bring tonight's talk to an end. Rahimallahu man qara'a Surah Al-Fatiha ma'a as-salawati ala Muhammadin wa ali Muhammad.